My first time at Dhwani, when Ashwini sent the posters, I was actually very excited. As she said, and I'm sure some of you were able to watch other episodes in this public screening way, which I found myself sitting in the back and very moved by the idea that we come as citizens and watch this together. And I want to congratulate Dhwani and many people here, Ashwini, Srikhara, other people who are part of Dhwani. When you think of what they've done, it seems like the most obvious thing to do, but actually is something that we don't do enough. And I'm reminded the last time I saw something like this was during the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act. So some of you will remember in 2019, groups of citizens were gathering together and reading the preamble. So it's sort of fitting that Shyam Benegal picks for the last episode the making of the preamble. And I was reminded of how much there was a real discussion about what the Constitution means for our time. That was 2019. Here in Bangalore, opposite Town Hall, there were gatherings. I had to go to talk about the Constitution to Pune. And Pune, Mominpura is an area where people were holding protests, and some of us went there. So I want to start by saying I think this is very important. I think this is an act of citizenship. As in her very generous introduction, Ashwini referred to the work that I've done. I see myself as a student of the Constitution, and I think given where the Constitution is, it will constantly change. So I first saw Samvidhaan and the episodes when they came out in 2014, and in preparation for this I was just trying to think of what were the circumstances that came in. When I first saw it, I responded to it very differently. And I'm very curious. Ashwini has told me that the format is that the person who has been invited speaks for 15 to 20 minutes. But I think the real value of this is what Dhwani is trying to do, is have a conversation about what the Constitution means to us in the time that we live in, and how do we make sense of what this generation, I think in some ways, this was the greatest generation of Indians. This is the generation which took us to freedom, and the sheer diversity represented in the assembly is quite remarkable. So as we watch this, there are these little names that come up. I've been studying the Constitution for some time, but occasionally when I watch Samvidhaan, there's a particular member who stands up and speaks, and I wonder who's that person. So in preparation for this, I was also looking at, and I was going to suggest to Ashwini that a great complement to this is the Constitution of India .net. That's a website where actually you can get a lot of information on who these people who were speaking were, and it's actually done it in a very accessible way. And maybe later we can sort of also talk about that and mention particular people. So I'll just say a couple of things before we get into our discussion. I'm really looking forward to that. But I want to say that in 2025, and as we sit and think of watching this episode and the things that it covers, and I'll briefly talk about some of those things. We've all watched together, so I don't need to summarize it. But there are some things that stand out when you think of the discussion that they had then, and how does it apply in the times that we live in. Right? So, as we saw, Shyam Benegal, was telling Ashwini, I didn't know it, I had to check his Wikipedia page. He was around 80 when he directed this. Right? So he passed away last December, almost 90 at that time. So this series was made in 2014. I'm also thinking of the time when this series was made. And when I first saw it, I was very sanguine about it. I said, it's good that they've created something about the Constitution. But some of this we know, and everything seems secure. Right? By 2019, when you're reading the preamble, there's a real sense that that document and what it represents is under threat. Right? And by the time we come to last year's general elections, it is not surprising that one of the main campaign issues was, is there a threat to the Constitution? Right? And can that order exist? Now, I try and be objective about things like the Constitution. Somebody might say, look, we are now 75 years, so next week on November 26th, we will mark 76 years of the adoption of this constitution. So that's something. But we also know that one doesn't need to hold on to certain things. And if you look at the history of constitutions around the world, there are many constitutions which were very good for their time, but they didn't last, or people felt that we need to change it. So as a student of the constitution, I try to be objective about it. Right? So having completed 76 years is quite extraordinary. In the episode that we saw, there's a Muslim member, I think his name is Hassan, Jude Hassan, who draws a comparison to Pakistan. And his point, as you will recall, is there's some criticism that it's taken so long to make this constitution, but Pakistan has not yet started doing so. Right? And as Swarabhaskar tells us, Pakistan gets its first constitution in 1972, 25 years after they became independent. Watching it today, I'm immediately thinking of what's happening in Pakistan over the last 2 weeks. Right? So their constitution has had one more amendment, the 27th Amendment, which has struck quite a grievous blow to the last constitution. So Pakistan's had 3 constitutions, and this fundamentally changes it. It's given one man all power, Field Marshal Munir. Pakistan's judiciary has been completely altered. There's now a federal constitutional court. There's a very nice resignation letter by Justice Mansoor Ali Khan, who was passed over for Chief Justice a couple of years ago, but he stayed on. But that resignation letter went viral. Some of you may be able to find it. It's a very beautiful expression of his loyalty to the Constitution. And he says, this amendment means that I cannot be party to this Constitution, and I resign as a judge of the Supreme Court. So I think one of the things to think about is when we look at what happened in Nepal recently, what's happening in Bangladesh this past week, in Sri Lanka, down south, they had a really remarkable general election last year, and they have a new government there. Some people in this country, say this with some pride. Our constitution has lasted for 75 years, and all these are things. And I think that's a bit silly. South Asia as a region has had a common history. When I think of our thing, I think we've been lucky in many respects that we've had this constitution which has been there. It's never been continuous. During the emergency, that system did last for over 18 months. It was formally suspended. There have been others. My friend Arun has written a book called India's Undeclared Emergency. And part of his argument is that what we have seen in the last decade is the constitution is kept there in form, but in practice it's being hollowed out. Right? So I think in that sense it's something for us to, it's not a matter for us to take some false pride in and say, oh, we are better than other people around us, but to try and say, are we living up to the ideals of that? So I think what is fascinating about the episode for me, watching it with everyone, is at the very beginning when so many people get up and speak about the preamble. So as someone who's studies the Constitution, this is a book that's come out a couple of months ago. It's called Assembling India's Constitution. It's written by 2 scholars, Rohit Day and Ornith Chan. And they've written this book to say that what we saw in the last episode of Shyam Benegal's wonderful documentary is a reflection of the kind of enthusiasm there was in the 1940s amongst a host of people. So it wasn't just the 300 odd people who gathered in the Constituent Assembly. Everybody who was alive at that time was really seized of it. And this book, coming on in the 75th anniversary, discloses a lot of documents which scholars and others also were not aware of. And the point is, while what we saw is the debate within the assembly, outside of the assembly also people were very agitated. And these were ordinary people. They were fishermen's associations comprised of people who were not even literate in some ways, but they were very conscious that this is happening. We have to think of the larger anti-colonial movement. So in India that was a very widespread movement which affected a lot of ordinary people. So and they knew that this is a really important moment where we are drafting a constitution and we have that. So this book is written to dispel this idea that the people sitting in the Constituent Assembly were elites. Right? I have never been very sympathetic to that. Even as we saw in just episode 10, If you look at the number of people who are speaking, they represented what Ambedkar would call the depressed classes or the backward classes. There were 15 women in the assembly, there were Muslims, there were Sikh members. In some ways, I think that Constituent Assembly is much more representative than our representative institutions are today. Right? So we are quite aware that the BJP has not, even fielded a single candidate for Lok Sabha elections. So where you take the Lok Sabha, which is constituted after the 18th general election last year, how representative is it compared to 75 years ago? Right? And although some of them were clearly speaking in English, there were Dalit women in the assembly, there were people from all strata of life, because it was a very different kind of time, and the people who were representatives were very different. So one statement that really stood out for me was Mahavir Tyagi's point that we have to be careful in a democracy, that we don't end up doing what many democracies do, which is you create a professional class of politicians. And he says, beware of this class. They do nothing else, they have nothing else to fall back upon. They continue to constantly be reproducing themselves. I think what he meant was they will constantly look for elected positions. What he may not have anticipated is the dynastic party rule that we've seen in every political party in this country, right? Regardless of whichever party is dominant in India. And I think that's a very perceptive comment by Mr. Tyagi, and I also decided to find out more about Mahavir Tyagi and what was his background, what made him so aware of certain things. A couple of other things, and then let's open it up for a discussion. I was very struck, given the polarization in our society today around religion, that the people who moved amendments, you have H.V. Kamath wanting to put God in the Constitution, and you have Rajeshwar Prasad wanting to put secularism in the Constitution. Both of those were negatived. So the original Constitution didn't have either a reference to God or a reference to secularism. The word socialism was also not there, and we know that comes in, as Swara Bhaskar says, 25 years later, through the 42nd Amendment, in the middle of the emergence. Right? So, and people still get quite worked up about why is the word secular there, why is the word socialist there, which was originally rejected but brought in through an amendment 25 years later. Right? But I think the word socialism today has a new currency. A lot of people are really excited about Zoran Mamdani, and Mamdani talks about democratic socialism. Right? And that, arguably, that is the socialism that is represented in the directive principles, in other parts of our constitution. So just following that trajectory of how they debated and the other thing, if the idea of an elite consensus, every time we watch these episodes or you read the 5,500 pages of the Constituent Assembly, you realize that is simply not true. As we could see, there's a lot of bickering, there's a lot of disagreement. Even people within the Indian National Congress were not of one mind. One forgets that the Nationalist Congress was a very different entity. If you check constitutionofindia.net, it gives you the party composition. So there were members from the Hindu Mahasabha, there were members from the Janasangh, there were members from the Communist Party as well. So both the right and the left were represented. Many people actually were also members of the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress also had people whom today we would call Hindu nationalists. Right? And so there are also debates about, and you would have seen these in other episodes, debates about preservation of the cow, special significance of the cow, and that was allowed, and that was agreed to by many people. Right? So in some ways you could say maybe we were lucky in the sense that because there were people of every political stripe represented in the Constitution, and our Constitution, as Mr. Naziruddin Ahmed says, it's a Constitution full of contradictions. And I think he's right, because this is a Constitution which promises minorities religious protection, also says in a very strange provision, Article 48, that the cow has a special status, not for religious reasons, but for reasons of animal husbandry. And when you read Article 48, you have to really scratch your head and say, what is this provision doing? Right? And if you're talking about animal husbandry, then there are many farm animals that we need to protect. Why is the cow singled out? Right? So the scholar Tarunab Khaitan has a very nice piece on what are the directive principles, and he says this was a way of negotiation and compromise. So you keep people who are otherwise unhappy about this. The Hindu nationalists would be happy because the cow is mentioned. How is it mentioned is not important. As long as it's there, they are happy. Then there are other, the Communist parties wanted labor rights. That's also given. It's deferred. We don't need to solve it all now, but it's there. You can fight for it X number of years. And you think of the Uniform Civil Code, which may be upon us any time now. Today the labor codes have been announced. The labor codes were drafted during the pandemic, but 6 years later, perhaps because of the Bihar results, they think we can go ahead. Right? And we know that the UCC is also probably likely to come our way. Right? But they foresaw the UCC. And maybe that's why the genius of this document is it gives every group in Indian society something to keep them within the tent in some ways. Right? There's something in this constitution that we can fight for. And whatever be your view of the BJP and the RSS, one has to give them credit in the sense the RSS, which also celebrated its 100th year this year, has been an organization which has been working at its goals assiduously, carefully over 100 years. Right? And maybe there's a lesson for everyone else who probably doesn't like their politics, that you also have to build a movement slowly, activate people, have discussions about what the constitution is. Maybe in small rooms like this. When you think of the origin of the RSS in small places, in small shakhas, today it is the world's largest civil society organization. If you look at the number of shakhas that are there, it's extraordinary. Right? It's disconcerting to many of us. Our Prime Minister has a great way where he calls the constitution a holy book. Right? That itself is a great undermining of that book. Right? Because as we saw, it is not a holy book at all. It is a completely human-made creation. And that is why I think we should resist also attempts at deifying the constitution. Right? It is something, as they said, it's been amended more than 100 times by 2014. Now it's coming up on 110. I can't remember the EWS amendment was 103rd, right? Yeah. But we've come up to at least, I think, 109 or so, or somewhere there. And we know that will keep happening. So it is capable of amendment, and we should. But it should be something that we should all discuss and have a chance to, how do you alter something which was designed for 1950? My colleague Sanjay Jain gets quite upset. He says, where are persons with disability in the Constitution? And you have to say the Constitution is silent about LGBT rights, about disability rights. But that may not be a failing. That, I call them the greatest generation, but they were men and women of their time. Right? And you can't give them retrospectively great foresight. You have to say they were humans. They tried to anticipate things, but they couldn't have anticipated. So it is for us to then say, in our time, what does this constitution mean? How do we make it speak to issues that we care about? And that's why I think it's important that we do screenings like this, discuss the constitution, take the text and say, what does the preamble mean? Right? And I'll end with just, again, thinking of the three warnings that Ambedkar ends with. Right? And he says, will India be able to keep up its democracy? Speaking in 1949, he's very aware that this large subcontinental nation has struggled. Right? There have been lots of back and forth over the last 1,000 years of different dynasties, different groups coming in. And so he says it's a moment of optimism, but we have to be aware of the three dangers. Right? Many people have called it in that way. And he says, how can India remain democratic? For the second and the third, he gets an applause. But the first point that he makes, everybody is silent because they're all Gandhians. And basically he's saying, you do not get into bhakti and worship. And civil disobedience cannot be accepted. Right? And for the Gandhians in the assembly, that is, he's directly, taking on Gandhi, as Ambedkar several times did. And his notion about one person should not be allowed power speaks to us in a very different way, in a way that perhaps Dr. Ambedkar could not have anticipated. He spoke to the emergency generation in a way. They would have taken his reference to a man to be to a woman. In our time, we are back to thinking of a man who claims to be non-human, have divine powers. And so then, Ambedkar's warning of bhakti and loyalty, where he says, India, more than any other nation, is susceptible to these tendencies, and we should be careful. Right? So he says, let's go through constitutional means. We don't adopt civil disobedience that was justified against a foreign ruler, but not against our own people. So we must adopt that. we must give up certain habits and really commit to it. And the most moving part when he says we enter into a life of contradiction. I think it's very sobering to all of us that in 2025, what he said, and he probably hoped, think of the Constitution somewhat naively says, we will have certain measures only for 10 years. Right? And after 10 years, we will solve primary education problems and all of that. It turns out that these were much more entrenched. And 75 years later, those questions are very much with us. So I'll leave you to think of that. I was sitting and thinking of how do those warnings apply so much to us, right? And various other things. There's small little things that other people say which I thought, wow, this speaks to our time so much today, even though we are looking at something which is historical and just a recording of that. Yeah? So thanks, and I look forward to a discussion which I'm now convinced is not just something that we are doing, but as active citizens, and Dhwani has, I think, enabled this through this public screening, that we come together. We may not always know each other, but rather than sitting and watching Samvidhaan on an OTT platform, on a laptop or a phone, we have the opportunity to watch it together and say what we think of it. So thanks very much for facilitating that, and I look forward to your comments and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Please feel free.